He is our presenter today. So this is the third meeting of OWASP Boise. We've been meeting quarterly and discussing and putting on presentations around application security and kind of wider security topics. If you've missed either of the first two sessions, we have a YouTube channel out there, and we had some good sessions on application threat modeling and on security incident response in our previous two meetings. And we'll be recording this meeting and putting it out on the YouTube feed as well if you have a desire to go look at that after the fact. Joining us today is Peter Henggeler. He is the Senior Security Engineer at Recidiviz, which is a nonprofit supporting keeping down incarceration rates in in relation to the law enforcement and the judicial system. So he holds the CISSP certification and is one of our OWASP Boise chapter founding members. And so with that, as soon as you're ready to go, Pete, take it away.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. Sorry for the little bit of chaos. I have a couple kids that are homesick today, so it's been one of those mornings. Looks like we have a decent enough crowd. Do we want to do a quick round of introductions where everyone just pipes up and says name and where they're from, and we can keep this kind of casual? I'm Peter. I work at Recidiviz. I'm located here in Boise.
Yeah, I'm Luke. I'm the Senior Security Engineer at HealthWise with a focus on identity and access management. I'm actually now located on the East Coast in Virginia after a recent move.
I'm Todd. I'm also at HealthWise as a security analyst working on the team with Luke, but here in Boise.
I'm Travis. I work at HealthWise as the manager of security operations and development.
I'm Brienne. I work at Western Power Sports as a cybersecurity analyst.
I'm Nick. I work as a business development representative at StrongDM.
I'm also Nick, and I work at Plex as a apps tech engineer.
Awesome. Well, I will go ahead and probably embarrass myself in not knowing how Google Presentations works. Let me share my host disabled attendee screen sharing. Luke, could you give me access? Sorry, that was join.
You should be good now, Pete.
Okay, thank you. Cool. All right, can everyone see this? Cool. Okay. And I'm just gonna bring up my notes. And we'll get going. So the topic for today is around secure application logging. I can jump in and like I said, we'll keep this kind of casual. So if anyone hears anything they strongly disagree with, agree with, or have some thoughts, please by all means jump in. I'm Peter. I'm a security engineer. Here's my GitHub handle. I head the security program at a nonprofit based out of San Francisco, and I also helped form the OWASP Boise chapter with some of these guys. So I am excited to come here and share some thoughts on logging. It's funny I say share some thoughts. I borrowed liberally from two sources I really like on like logging for security in your application. One is OWASP's cheat sheet series for logging. And then another is a talk by Justin Massey, who's a product manager at Datadog, called a Crash Course in Audit Logs. Both of these are easily available. And if you're interested, hit me up and I can share a link. So a quick plug for OWASP. I mean, everyone here is aware of Boise OWASPs. So we're glad that we have the local chapter. We can get like-minded folks and people together to talk all things security. But another project, everyone knows OWASP's top 10, right? It's a great resource. But I always like to point people to other projects that OWASP has going on. And one of them is just the cheat sheet series, right? There's over 70 now cheat sheets available, right? So authentication cheat sheet, right? Access control, AJAX security. And for this talk, I looked quite a bit at what OWASP has available for logging. These are all open source. If you have a particular interest in security, I'd encourage you to reach out to the community around that particular cheat sheet and see what you can do to contribute. So that's just a plug for OWASP in general. Okay, so why talk about logging? Logging is one of those things that I think that you can tend to take for granted or not necessarily think it, it has a lot of security value. I started in development, and so logging for me was a debugging tool, right? But when you think about it, logging is one of your strongest controls for non-repudiation, right? And so you want logging that is available and useful. I guess that's my theory. As a lot of logging is either not available or it's not useful. And so, if we take a look at some non-useful logging, right? I'm sure we've all seen logs like this, right? And this comes from some of the Justin Massey's talk with Datadog, where he consults with customers who are trying to centralize their log in some kind of log aggregation tool like Datadog. But John Doe logged in to what, right? Failed login from random IP. Who did that, right? A password root was resent. Who triggered that? Where did it go, right? An org account was created, but no IP address. So I'm sure some of you might have some opinions too of what else, what's wrong with these logs, right? But I've definitely been guilty of writing logs that are sort of just a hodgepodge of, console logs that mean something to me at the time I was developing it, right, or working on the application, but don't really help create that audit trail that we hope our logs provide. And so one of the things that as security professionals, I think we should define, and this is where I'm leaning heavily on some of the work in the OWASP cheat sheet, right, is the first one is you should communicate a purpose of logs to your development teams, right? What does the security team want to see out of their logs, right? Or if I'm a developer and there's not a security team, what are the security qualifications that I want to bake into it, right? So a purpose of a log is being able to identify security events and detect threats. A purpose of a log could be that you want it to highlight your compliance and policy violations, right? Anything that affects the particular compliance regime that you're in, right? So if you are a healthcare company, right? Any kind of application behavior that is governed under the HIPAA HIPAA requirements or high trust requirements is probably something that you'd want to have logged. Obviously, a central purpose is non-repudiation, right? Which is just the idea that if somebody does something in my system, they can't deny that they did it, right? Because I have some evidence, right? And so your logs should provide, should be part of that proof that you're establishing to show that this was in fact, the person did do something. And then just kind of post hoc, forensics and incident investigation. So number two is you need to categorize what are the event data sources that matter for your application, right? So obviously, most modern applications, you're talking about like a server-side application. So that's obviously a component of your logs, right? But you also have to think about what the client of your logs are. Is this a desktop app like Slack? Is it a mobile app? Is there a lot of JavaScript rendered in the browser that does some component of your application logic, right? So those are also potentially a vector for logs is coming from the client itself. Increasingly, a big one is infrastructure, right? So if you're in a cloud platform, the databases you're using, if you're on a server, the server logs, obviously things like firewall logs, all of these, collectively come together to think about your application or your information system. And then another one that we've seen a rise in, right, is third-party services. So if you are using like an identity as a service provider like Okta or Auth0, SendGrid, Twilio, Stripe, any of these kind of large service providers that we're integrating into our applications today are fair game and can really enrich the logs that would have just come from your application if you could have those logs centralized in some kind of way. So number three, and again, this is all of these numbers correspond, or most of these numbers correspond to sections and chapters of the OWASP cheat sheet on logging. Where should you store your logs? The file system, sometimes that's the only option, but you need to think carefully about, partitioning where those files go, the storage that you have available. One thing that should go without saying is you can't go in and modify these logs, right? So the permissions on your files need to have strict guardrails, right? So that you can point to a log and say, yeah, we know this hasn't been tampered with because nobody has permissions to come through and modify it. A lot of times we'll see logging that happens within a database. Again, that's fine. You just need to make sure that similar to the file system, you have correct permissions around the individual, the tables and queries that generate those logs to make sure that only the system that's supposed to be able to generate the logs is doing it, and no one else. And then obviously a SIEM is what I would say is recommended. That's kind of my own. OWASP doesn't have an opinion there. I come out with an opinion on it. I'm happy to hear other people's thoughts, but if you're investing a lot of time and energy getting your infrastructure, your workstations, your corporate network into some kind of centralized log aggregation tool, I think it makes sense that you would do the same for your application. Okay, so some of that, so far it's kind of been the easy stuff, I think. Where to log, why do you want to log? I think a much a much more interesting question is, which events do you actually want to log? One particular thought is you could log validation failures, because any kind of strange validation failure on your input or output is potentially evidence of a malicious request. Authentication trail, right? So successful and failure logins, signups, multi-factor authentication attempts. Any kind of session management failure. So if you've seen some kind of odd modification of like a cookie, it would be worth logging. Application errors, syntax and runtimes can often indicate some sort of issues going on. And so I would also recommend that, logging for security events occurs in the same place that logging for development teams debugging their applications go. Because sometimes it's not until you get that stack trace and you look at it and you think, oh, this was an attempted SQL injection. So some other thoughts: application and system startups and shutdown, specifically around your infrastructure as well, and higher risk functions. Addition or deletion of users, changing privileges, assigning users an API token, revoking API tokens, any kind of use of administrative privileges, access to payment cardholder data. One useful approach here, I think, is when you are going through some kind of exercise, like a threat modeling exercise, ask yourself, what's the audit trail we should be establishing, right? When we're breaking down the flow, right? Or if you don't threat model, it could be, when your product managers are writing user stories, what are the, if a client came to us and asked us for evidence of one of the events in this user story, what would those, what events do we predict we'd want to be keeping a record of? And another suggestion is legal and other opt-in permissions. So if somebody's accepting some kinds of terms of service, changing the SKU within their product, that's also worth keeping a record of. So on top of thinking about, what types of events you want to record, it's also worth thinking about, what are the attributes on an event that you want to record. I think the way to break this down that makes the most sense is a who, what, when, where, why approach, right? So when you want to have a event timestamp, you want to standardize that timestamp, right, across your different systems. You want where, what application was this on? What version of the app were you running? What was the cluster or host name or the server IP address where this event originated? Service name, protocol, geolocation, those types of information. Who, user's IP address, and some kind of user identification, right? ID, username, a GUID, whatever we use to, you have to be mindful, right, of privacy concerns here, but some way to track who was doing this activity, which authenticated user, if you have an authentic app that requires authentication. And then what? So the type of event, the severity of the event, security relevant event flag. I like this idea quite a bit, right? Which is when you're logging, you have some kind of Boolean value that just flips this if audit equals true, right? Or authentication equals true. Some way of categorizing this particular log into a broader bucket of logs that security would be interested in, and then obviously some kind of description. It's important to think also about what data you want to exclude from your logs, right? So obviously, sensitive source code, connection strings, commercially sensitive information, passwords, tokens, keys, session identification values, information that a user has not consented to have collected. That's also an important one, right? So if you have some kind of if the user has not consented to you collecting certain information, or you allow the user some kind of anonymity, you want to make sure that that's reflected in your logging. This is sort of a side note. It's kind of an interesting story, but the as far as what also not to include in your logs, when Bernie Madoff went down, apparently the logging of the application that he was using, or that his developers were building, like there were logs that were like, this is where the fraud begins, right? And like in the logs of the application, it explicitly like outlined that they knew they were committing a crime by doing this. So I suppose if you're committing a crime, also you'd exclude those logs. Some other thoughts, use the default logging framework, right? So if you're on Rails and Django, whatever framework you're using, probably comes with a pretty standardized logging framework. Suggest that you don't reinvent the wheel here. That reviewing your logs as part of code reviews, application testing, and security verification is a good idea. This is good. You can ensure your logging is working, that events are classified correctly. If you're having a pen test run against your applications, review the logs and see what your logging looks like in light of the pen test activity. Can you accurately track what the tester was doing? Review for potential injection attacks into your logs. Chaos testing, right? What if you're putting them? If you're syncing your logs to Splunk? What happens if you turn off Splunk? Do they, have you configured your infrastructure appropriately to make sure that you don't have a gap? And then wherever you store your logs, thinking about appropriate access control, right? So that only authorized individuals within your organization are able to access the logs. Okay, and so then now I'm just having some other thoughts that I came across through either OWASP chapter, and now we're getting to some of Justin Massey's points in the Datadog presentation. One thing is that Datadog has routinely seen is issues with the IP address that people are using, specifically if they're logging the exported4 header. So in this example, you have John Doe coming from an IP address of 1234 being routed through a load balancer, and the web application was using the exported4 header and recording that as the event, right? And so what you want to see is 1234. What you don't want to see is 10.0.0.5. So when you go through and you review your logs and the IP address that you're recording, make sure that you're not picking up like the IP address of your load balancer or some middle service, right? You want to make sure that you have the originating IP. Another thought is that the security team could help normalize logging formats. If we compare earlier, John Doe logged in, right? You could have a log that's more structured, right, in some kind of JSON format or standardized normalized format. So, user equals John Doe, event equals authentication, outcome success, IP 1234. Auth type was OAuth, and type audit, that's that security flag. And so, here's a little sample Python where you could say, you know, our audit log works this way, right? This is the shared function that we use for auditing. If the security team has this request that developers start logging in a specific structure, you know, they could help roll what they want that centralized logging library to look like. Another thought that comes up is that with, you know, microservices and distributed systems, you know, it's often, you know, I log in and there's probably a chain reaction of different pieces of infrastructure and different services being interacted with. And so if you have some kind of way to like track a request ID, so if the event is login, right? And let's say, you know, there's 3 services that come in, ensuring that the event GUID is, you know, the event ID is passed on to the extra services, so that in some kind of analysis down the line, you can look at like, okay, here is the same event shared across these 3 services and trace it back that way. And I think that's it. I didn't have a question slide. So yeah, that's it.
Awesome. Thanks, Pete. I have some questions for you and conversation. I loved your point about utilizing the default framework, logging framework for your language. It seems like recently we've also learned that we need to keep our default logging frameworks updated, right? With log4j. And maybe the hard lesson learned recently was it's an easy component to forget to maintain, but if it's executing commands from malicious requests, it's an important one to keep in mind as you think through all the logging for your application.
Yeah, you know, I guess I'd open that up to anyone else and get their thoughts. I obviously log4j kind of hung over this whole presentation and was not really the purpose of what I wanted to talk about. I kind of want to get more into the nitty gritty of what types of logs you should be logging, or what type of events you should be logging. But yeah, I mean, I think the concern with rolling your own types of framework, right, is that you're potentially introducing all kinds of, you know, performance issues, right? If you're trying to invent your own, you know, way that it rotates and rolls over files, right? Like you have a risk of, you know, DDoSing yourself, right? Because you weren't, you know, clearly cleaning up, or, you know, sufficiently cleaning up the logs. But yeah, no, I mean, on that point, I don't know if anyone has any disagreement on it. I'd kind of be interested in light of some of the recent news with log4j, what people think.
Yeah, and maybe one that's more relevant to the presentation today. That one obviously is kind of top of mind. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on, as you talked about which events to log, and you kind of went through the categories. Do you feel like those things are pretty well defined and static, or do they need to be rethought through every so often? Like in response to when OWASP puts out a new top 10, do we need to kind of look at that and then reevaluate what our application is logging, or will these general categories kind of do it for us ongoing if we hit the ones that we think of, you know, like in the presentation today?
That's a really good question. I imagine that, for instance, something like if you're using a web application firewall, and you're using that to try to trigger you know, some kind of incident on your end, right? Some alert or blocking an IP address. I imagine that would be very dynamic, right? Because you might be taking in new rules all the time as OWASP or you know, threat detection agencies publish these, right? And say, hey, you know, here's this new attack, and here's how you can look for it in your logs, right? I imagine that would be really dynamic. I think there's a type of log that would also be really dynamic, which is if you think about the CRUD events and when you're in your application, right? So you sell I don't know, you're an e-commerce site and you sell mascot costumes, right? You know, there's going to be a create, update, and delete of the objects in your database, right? And those are events that I would probably say uniformly you should probably log, right? So you have the trail that someone added something, someone deleted, someone updated. I don't know that the read events you need to log every single event, right? But read events are ones that I think would be like interesting to think about. So if in this e-commerce site somebody goes and they can pull the account information and the credit, you know, information about the credit card that's registered, you've read that, you didn't update it, that's probably something you might want to log in your application, right? Because you've touched on some of the more highly sensitive regulated pieces of data in your application, right? And regardless whether it's create, read, update, delete on any type of data, that's going to be like very fluid based on, you know, if you're on 2-week sprints and the development teams are always building on the applications or adding new features, the vector of what you should be logging is constantly going to be changing, right?
Yeah.
And so I also think probably a good point about that is like it's probably also not sustainable for the security team to stay on top of what features the development teams are working on and what they should be logging out of those, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you have some kind of like security checklist or, you know, threat modeling template or you know, some kind of pre-feature release security check, some questions about, you know, what needs to be logged and are you logging sufficiently is also probably valid, because you know, you also don't want security to be slowing down the release of these features.
Yeah, and thinking about that more, maybe that review is more helpful in terms of what you're alerting on that you're seeing within the logs. Maybe what you log isn't as dynamic, but what should trigger the attention of a security team is kind of always evolving, where you wouldn't look at a certain type of log before, but suddenly people have found a way to exploit some particular method, and now we need to have alerting in a place that we didn't have before. Maybe that's also there where there'd be some value of reviewing what we're logging and what we're alerting on over time.
Yeah, and I mean, I think our last talk was about incident response, right? And I think this is part of your incident response, right? Your retrospectives, like a review of your logs and whether they were doing, you know, providing that essential necessary trail. It's probably also a good conversation to have as part of that. Another thing, I didn't add a slide on this that I was thinking about though last night was that I'm always kind of interested in ways that security can help like drive the business of you know, like usually we don't think of security as like adding features that are, you know, that customers are paying for, right? Often I think security gets thought of as kind of a roadblock to releasing the true money-making product. But having being really confident in the audit trail that you provide, you know, is something that I think that you could take to your product management team and say like, hey, you know, we're really comfortable not only in our ability to perform, you know, incident response and analysis of what's happening in the application. You could potentially even push the product team to make these audit logs available, right? Depending on the industry. So a lot of customers, especially like B2B customers, you know, would be interested in having the ability to pull their own audit logs, right, out of what's happened within a system, right? And so, not saying these logs would end up in the same place, but I also think that there's a version of this where the security team, you know, helps product develop an audit trail feature within the subscription to the application. If you use GitHub organization, right, they have a tremendous audit log, right? Apps like that, I think, are really where enterprise customers are interested in being able to pull all the actions that have happened in their accounts.
I got more if nobody want to open it up to other people for questions. I got a couple, but if anybody else has a question, please.
I got a question for you, Pete, on this. When you look at the stuff that you do not want in the logs, you talked about like keys and other like pretty much sensitive information. Do you see that once a system like this is stood up, that it's really the security team to do like regex or basically scanning for unauthorized data in the logging? Is that really what they do? They pretty much look at overseeing and then do that, or how do you see a mechanism to prevent essentially critical or unauthorized logs to end up in your centralized logging systems or decentralized systems, however you decide to set it up?
That's a great question. I know if you're using like a vendor like New Relic, and I believe Splunk has a functionality like this where you, like for your log aggregation tool, I think a lot of those products have introduced like de-identifying mechanism and controls in place, right? So like, you know, if it's an email, you know, remove information about the email, right? Or make sure it's encrypted or whatever before it's stored. Yeah, I mean, but if you're not using a product like that, I think that's a really great question to come up with, right? And that's probably part of like security assurance is like maybe leveraging some like data loss prevention best practices, right? Like if the log is essentially just a file on a server somewhere, well, what's in that file, right? And how do you detect what information, you know, our social security numbers in this log or whatever. Yeah, I don't know that I have a right answer, Travis, but I think that would be a good exercise, especially if you have like legacy logging, right? Like, so if the product is starting tomorrow and you can build in all these requirements about what to log and what not to log, that's great. But you know, if you have a 20-year-old company with a bunch of older applications, right? I think that would be a worthy task for security is to like actually at some point go and review what's actually in those logs.
Yeah, and I look at it as, you know, a developer needing more data to solve an issue, and then they ingest maybe another field that previously wasn't in there, put in a log to solve their problem or to make it efficient, not knowing that that just violated the base policies for the logging infrastructure. Just think that, oh no, I was just doing, you know, discovery work on a bug. And I see like scenarios like that. It's what are strategies to sustain it? And I think that that's, you know, like you're stating, an ongoing investigation like process or maybe tools that we could leverage.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on like tools that you've come across that would be useful, or does anybody?
I know that we've used in the past things to scan for specific, like I know on like email and OneDrive stuff, like data loss prevention tools that scan and look for specific keys and things. And on your previous slide, when you talked about data to do it, I could see us using something where we look at like what is PHI and housing, just like understanding what's supposed to be blocked and potentially making rules or alert systems. You talked about it leveraging the SIM. And I really think that's the integration point. That's the advantage of the SIM. Maybe it doesn't hold on to logs with the same retention or difference, but that could be set up to be like, hey, it identified an unauthorized logging attribute inside of it. But I'm not, I think it's like part of the security process, if you will.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that I didn't even think about that, but I'm adding it to my list of things to worry about.
Hey Pete, it's Jesse. So to tie into some of this conversation, and to your point of multiple systems or older systems and newer systems, what are your thoughts on something like regarding an inventory of your logs, knowing not only what to log but where those logs are and what kind of data is in them?
That's a really good thought. I mean, that this was all kind of green pasture presentation. Like you're writing new logs. Where do you want those to go? Like one problem, if you just started somebody in a new organization, those questions you just asked, like what are our logs? Where are they? And what's in them? I imagine that could be pretty hard to get an answer to in some organizations, right? If it's like, oh, no one's touched that app in 8 years, it's just kind of been running, right? Like reviewing, building that inventory, I think would be very valuable. I also think it would be difficult, and it's probably something that security would need to collaborate with on different teams.
Yeah. Pete, you talked about the SIM and its relevance and recommending it, and you made it a good point about non-repudiation being kind of a key value that you're trying to get out of security logging. What do you think about? I mean, can you really have non-repudiation without having your logs actually forward out of your local app environment into a centralized logging or a SIM, right? Because the attack pattern is if somebody can compromise your app, they're going to have this cleanup after the attack and basically try to obliterate the tracks, right? Try to clean up after themselves. So I would almost think that non-repudiation isn't even possible unless you have your logs kind of bumping off to some next thing down the line to where they're safe from a local compromise of your application.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, right? I'm always a fan of like when you can point to the cloud vendor, right, or ecosystem you're in, and just saying so I work currently in Google Cloud, right, and there are logs that I can't, once they're logged, I don't have permissions to go like delete them, right? And so and nobody could, even if the app were, they couldn't compromise like a little function app to reach those logs. So saith Google, right? And so it's their responsibility, and it's covered in our agreement with Google, right? As opposed to having to show why this particular drive is partitioned in such a way and isolated in such a sandbox that even if the application and the server the app was on was compromised, the local logs couldn't be touched. I think it's just that it's that classic thing where you have less responsibility as far as attesting to why something's the case.
Yeah, but
I think that's a really
understand
good point.
your position, right? If you do have that platform situation with a vendor, you can say, okay, I feel pretty good about it. Would be very difficult to get at this logs held by the cloud provider, or maybe this exists in my environment and I need to make sure I get it somewhere where it will be a little bit harder to get at.
Yeah, but I do think that's a great point, right? And even if I think a lot of these tools, you might be logging locally and then have some kind of like agent that's like shipping them, right? And in kind of real time to some system, right? And having the having that backup copy shipped to Splunk or to Kibana or whatever the tool is, provides you that level of assurance, right? And again, using the out of the box feature, right, that Splunk or Elk provides, right, as opposed to rolling your own kind of bash script that automatically takes the files and backs them up. You know, the more that you can point to, this is a vendor's tool. This is not some kind of custom process we wrote to back these up. It's easier to establish that chain of custody.
Yeah. Another one I had for you was a lot of this we get out of like hard lessons by being involved in security incidents and realizing the data that you need is not there, and in a retro then you kind of know what you need next time. Have you encountered situations in real life where there was a particular piece of data that you wanted in that log and you just didn't have, or is there any easy to miss like information in logs that might not be super obvious that you would want to log, but not having that particular piece of data kind of really hampers you in understanding what occurred in your application?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've seen no logging, right? Like you look at the logs coming out of a service or application and realize there are no logs being generated. I have seen the non-structured types of logs, right? Where it's, I think that's probably the most common, is the logs don't follow any format where it's easy to filter down on, right? So like if you can use some kind of JSON log to capture an event, right? And one of the attributes is I don't know, failed login, or failed MFA, right? Or failed password reset, or successful, whatever it is. And you can just click filter down to that. It's a lot cleaner, right? Than looking at like, well, what's the format of this log in the description body, right? If it's just kind of this free form, whatever was entered into the logging function, that's up to the developer. And
yeah, and you might be in a live fire situation, right, where you're desperately trying to understand what's occurring as you kind of see an attack come in, and if you have to, there's not a quick way to search your logs. That doesn't feel so good in the heat of the moment.
And also the exported for header, I've come across that myself, where I've seen that we've relied on that header for our logging or for like IP restrictions, and that's easily spoofed, right? The exported for header is it's you can just change it in the request header, right? And so if you trust that, you're trusting user input. So
awesome. Any other questions or conversation? All right. Well, if we're feeling good about that, maybe we'll move towards concluding here. Thanks everybody for attending. Like I said, the recording will also go up onto the OWASP Boise YouTube feed. If you found value in the meeting today, there's the meetup group where I'd say that's the best place to make sure you're joined to, or if you think other people that you know might have some interest in the topics that we go over, have them join the meetup group, then they'll get alerts for when the meetings come up every couple months or so. So thanks again to our presenter, Pete. I certainly learned a lot today, and I appreciate everybody coming. Have a great day.